Pat, thanks for joining me.
Is this where I say you're welcome?
I don't know. You say whatever you want. so,
Absolutely, Greg.
so,
Thanks for
so,
having me.
yeah. Well, as my brother-in-law, I suppose the dynamic of this one will be a little bit different, perhaps.
Mm,
Y'all have never, the family's never been shy about giving me a hard time, so I'm prepared for a little bit of that. Uh,
yeah, yeah. Nobody's ever good enough for my sister, Greg. So,
well, that's
but you're
fair.
you, you're pretty close. So,
Nah, well,
grateful to have you as a part of the family. Even though I'm going to still call my sister by her first last name, which is Bills. But that's okay.
yeah, I call her Bills whenever I'm frustrated with her. Just so you know, that's okay, Bills.
Appropriately so. There's a lot of frustrating things about the Bills, so no problem.
Well, so I want to start by unpacking that background and relationship just a little bit.
Sure.
Obviously, I married into the Bills clan. Y'all are a big family, 5 kids.
Mm,
But just, give us a sense of kind of where you come from, what that family life is like, because and I think that's important. The reason I'm going to emphasize this for listeners is that there's so much ministry and commitment to God's kingdom that comes out of that background. It's been
mm.
a privilege for me to join into that dynamic, but I'm positive it shapes your journey. And so, what would you say about kind of where you come from?
Well, initially, I would say that I think anybody's family of origin shapes kind of where they land. And, having four sons of my own, somebody told me that you probably shouldn't save as much for college as you should for, therapy for your own kids' lives at one point or the other. But I am extremely fortunate to have been born in a family that certainly has a commitment to the story of Scripture and is deeply rooted in the history of the Churches of Christ. My grandparents were founding members of a church in a predominantly rural farming community. It's not necessarily a farming community anymore, but
Hmm.
I think that when I think of the way I was raised, I would encourage people to think of kind of Andy Griffith Mayberry type dynamic where there was one high school and two middle schools and everybody knew kind of everybody,
Hmm.
and yet it was still a town of 25,000 folks. But being a part of that town where your parents are significant components kind of to the culture of that town. Dad was a local medical doctor, and my mom, uh, traditional kind of homemaker. We lived on a farm, but both of them grew up there in small town Tennessee, and were high school sweethearts. Dad was president of the student council. Mom played basketball, and like I said, in some ways, it's a very typical Southern white Americana story.
Yeah.
And mom and dad, moved back and wanted to raise a family there. And so all of my memories are growing up in basically one city. And
Yeah.
like you said, I'm the oldest of five, but our family dynamic was deeply tied to my grandparents and the
Hmm.
role of course, those would be my paternal grandparents, not maternal. And deeply embedded in that was even how I was named. I was named after my grandfather, who my mom's dad died when she was in college. And then my middle name is my great grandfather's first name. It's my grandfather's middle name. It's my
Hmm.
dad's middle name. It's my middle name. It's my first son's middle name. So
Hmm. Hmm.
there's this deep sense of family rootedness.
Yeah.
And so, not that it isn't without its fault and without its certainly its difficulties, but
Yeah.
it was a great way to grow up and experience life. And my dad is not the typical farmer. I should say farmer, not the typical doctor.
Right.
We didn't grow up at the country club and going on really expensive vacations every year. It was farm life. I mean, it really was. That's what my dad did for fun. So unfortunately, I didn't think it was near as much fun as he did. Which is one of the reasons why, I went to Harding. And Greg, you know that is Lipscomb was too close to home. I didn't want to be called on the weekend to come home and work or bale hay or whatever.
Hmm.
I wanted to get out of there,
Yeah.
and I think mom and dad recognized my need to kind of get out and experience life, and
Yeah.
so. It's hard for me to talk about my own family without thinking about the church culture that I grew up in as well. Because looking back on it, even though my church was extremely, conservative, fundamental, it was still the only Church of Christ in town that had a youth minister,
Yeah.
which is saying something when there's five other churches of Christ in a 25,000 member town.
Hmm.
And we were always kind of the ones that would be kind of on the leading edge of whatever conversation that may be, which was clapping during songs or
Right. Right.
clapping after a baptism or whatever. But but it was always this very loving, supportive, nurturing,
Yep.
and obviously a lot of that had to do with the fact that I was a male. I was never told no a day in my life,
Hmm.
especially with regards to church. And
Hmm.
so, if there is a better way to be set up for a healthy trajectory in a calling in ministry, I'm not sure that there is one. I mean, I
Yeah.
had loving parents, had a loving church, had loving grandparents, had great ministry experiences. I was a youth group junkie, and I went to Harding University and absolutely loved every bit of it.
Yep.
I loved going to chapel. I loved going to Bible classes. I loved meeting people. Obviously, I shouldn't say obviously, but being the oldest, I'm extroverted, and it just gave me a platform to really engage people at a high level.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
that when I think about kind of growing up in this family system, it certainly had its bumps and its difficulties, but it was so. I'm just so grateful for the way God has really kind of orchestrated that path for me,
Hmm.
which clearly with your story, and if your listeners know anything about your story, it's quite different than yours. So
It is. It
uh,
is. But I want to underline a commonality, which I think some listeners might hear and go, wow, that's a crazy statement to make, right? When you
sure,
say, I grew up in a fundamentalist church,
yeah,
and I can't imagine a better pathway into ministry. So, okay, but I want to talk about that because I think this experience is so common, despite the massive trend of people in our age range. You're a little older than I am, but we're sort of there in that, um, you know, young Gen X, old millennial section of people that are not only leaving the church, but leaving ministry in significant numbers, being pretty
mm,
much, done, or at least ministry or church among that tradition, that kind of tradition. And this isn't only Churches of Christ, as most
right,
people are
right,
aware if they're paying attention to the numbers. You're just saying, I can't do this anymore. I need something different. I need to serve God in a different way. And despite that, I think it's this really common story among people like us. I also grew up in that fundamentalist tradition, family background, quite different, as you noted. But nonetheless, the experience of those churches is really consistently this loving,
yeah,
tight knit, committed community. They're fundamentalists, so many of them, for the right reasons.
yeah,
They don't know any other way to be absolutely serious about obedience to God.
mm,
They're just that this is the way that they've been given. This is how they've been formed. This is the whole horizon, and I want to take this as seriously as possible. And that comes out in this sort of the dogmatism and the sometimes extreme vicious legalism in its unhealthy expressions. But so much of what I experienced wasn't that.
right,
Maybe if you hit the trigger on a particular issue, but otherwise it's no. God tells me to love my community and love others and be generous and on and on and on, right? Just think of the fundamentals of following Jesus and faith and they're all about they're 100% in. And those experiences of community life and care and seriousness about Scripture and a willingness to sacrifice for others and so on. It's just the fabric of growing up in that kind of environment that I think is as good a pathway into ministry as you can find. I'm sure there are other really good ones that are very different
Sure.
than ours, but I hear what you're saying, and I feel like that contrast between fundamentalism and a healthy on ramp to ministry actually stands up. It survives the potential obvious critique because what's really going on under the surface in the experience of that is so profoundly godly in a way.
Yeah.
And, so what I mean, does that strike you as more or less true?
Yeah, I think so, and that's well said. I guess what I want to say, Greg, is I hold that in what I hope would be obvious tension with, growing up in the South as a white male
Mm-hmm.
is drastically different than growing up in the South as a female or somebody wrapped in a different colored skin.
Yep.
Especially in Tennessee. Um, because I grew up hearing stories about, you know, one of my dad's closest friends was the first black, high school football player at their school, and you start hearing stories that kind of bring, my dad and my mom really uh, took seriously helping people in poverty, and even though it was a very privileged way of growing up. Now that I look back on it, there was definitely an inherent goodness
Mm-hmm.
and an appropriate naivete that doesn't excuse obviously the societal sins of racism or patriarchy or anything like that, but I do think that the goodness that was there was authentic.
Yes.
The goodness that came with coming back to church on Sunday night and singing hymns or doing an ice cream social, and the goodness of being committed to a midweek Bible study on Wednesday night at 7 o'clock, and the whole town knew that you can't have practice much past 7 o'clock on a Wednesday night because everybody just went to church. I mean,
Yeah.
like I said, it's very Andy Griffith kind of Mayberry-ish, but
Yeah.
at the same time, what a great way to learn some really distinct values that were just really incredible. Yeah, I'm one of those few people that actually remember, and I say one of those few people because I've asked a lot of people, talk to me about your calling in ministry. I can remember exactly where I was when I felt like God really gave me a burden to go into ministry. It was at this big youth rally in December of all times. Is we used to go to Youth in Action in Birmingham, Alabama, and I remember my mom hated it because it always started on like December 27th, and then we would get back on like the 30th, and my
Yeah.
mom would always be like, "Why are you out of school?" And this youth minister takes you away from us, and it was great. I mean, we got to go and hear a cappella and AVB, and sing off overhead projector slides, and hear Jeff Walling, who is still killing it, I guess. But anyway, but I remember sitting in the balcony waiting for a session to start, and this overwhelming sense of, oh, this is what these people do for a living.
Mm-hmm.
I think I want to do this.
Yeah.
And I'd always been told that I was gifted with people, and my parents were always very affirming of me, but that that combined with just the very positive experiences that I had with church, my local church context, just really just launched me into this deep love for the local church, and
Mm-hmm.
that just really saturated all of my experience. Even when I went to Harding, Greg, I jumped right into working with a local church,
Yeah.
and that was in 1995. So, in some ways, I've been in church work for 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
That is just bizarre for me to even think about. That in 1995, I just walked into the Bradford Church of Christ outside of Searcy and said, "Hey, I'm here with a program called Operation Youth from Harding. Can I teach your Wednesday night Bible class and your students?" And just the joy of that journey was just, it just seemed natural to what I was supposed to be doing. I mean, why wouldn't you get engaged in a local church? Because
Yeah.
that's what I'd always known. So
Yeah.
anyway, yeah,
Yeah.
great question. So
Yeah, and those sort of systemic sins and the problems that are in the background are often the foreground of what's going
sure,
on. It's not. I'm not saying you underplay them. Someone should underplay them in their estimation of what's valuable. But there's this baby bathwater thing that happens where in the critique of those things I think that then we end up underplaying everything else that's going on to our great detriment because
sure,
there's no ideal scenario. Like if you get those things right, then there's all these other things that are also still a mess in the local church community. And so it's the same dynamic with a different set of issues. And that's not to say those issues aren't the ones that we face aren't look, there are weightier matters, and it's scary sometimes when it turns out that your whole life the weightier matters were the ones that weren't going addressed,
yeah,
and so I'm not trying to level the playing field here and say everything's equal, but there is a need to, for me, be honest about the goodness that you're
sure,
talking about and recognize that that's good in a really deep way. It's not trivial that in
mm,
fact in these congregations that here's my experience in the midst of the patriarchy and the racism implicit or explicit, that there are a whole bunch of people that are actually affirming young women and
yeah,
encouraging them and actually going out of their way to stand in front of racist tendencies and love the people of color in their community, and that stuff is happening as well, which also gets sort of tossed a lot of times in the sweeping broad scale critique. And again, the reason I think that that's important is because you're always going to have something going on a societal or cultural level, and you have to value and support the people who are sort of the that are standing up against that on a personal level locally and leading the way in a different direction locally. And that seems just as valuable to me as making the public declarations about the systemic stuff. In fact, I think that often isn't quite as effective as actual people living out their faith in the right way. But anyway, I just that's such a stew of challenges
ooh,
that
boy, isn't it?
yeah. So in some ways, I guess we're making an assumption here when we talk about the pathway into ministry and what it is now and drawing that contrast to fundamentalism. What we're assuming is it's obvious that for you and me, we're no longer living in that world. We're not operating in that way. The biblicism doesn't look the same for us anymore, and we do have a different set of priorities and values in ministry and community formation and all that stuff. How did you get there? What was the path out of that into ministry, and then the ups and downs of moving into where you are now? What was the journey there?
Huh. Oh, about a 25-year
I
process.
told you we're going to record for at least an hour and a half, so you got time.
Um,
So what's
wow.
next? What's next after Harding? You graduate with a degree in youth ministry. Where do you go?
Well, I think what's next is just relationally. I got married between my junior and senior year in college, and that was a big deal because Deborah and I were both firstborn children, firstborn grandchildren on
Hmm.
both sides of the family. And I'm sure everyone around us thought, why are they doing this? They are way too young, which they would have been correct.
Because they went to Harding is the answer
Yeah,
to that
exactly.
question.
Because we sat on a swing, and that's what you do. Um, yeah, we were both in chorus, so it just made sense. But um, I guess the reason why I bring Deborah up is because she was the daughter of a Church of Christ preacher, a minister. And even though she spent most of her life in Fairfax, Virginia, her dad later transitioned to kind of the Bible Belt in Fort Worth. There was certainly a common understanding of what church life could and would look like. In fact, one of the things that endeared me so much to Deborah was her relationship with her own grandparents.
Mm.
And we would, instead of spending money to go out on dates, which so many options in Searcy, Arkansas, we would tongue in cheek for your listeners. Um, we would go out to her grandparents' farm, and we'd take her laundry, and we'd play cards, and we'd even drag out the hymn books and sing Church of Christ hymns in 4-part harmony. And as hokey and as weird as that sounds, it was just this beautiful representation of being a part of this great heritage.
Yeah.
And I knew that there were some uh, some tremendous theological holes.
Hmm.
Even though I couldn't name them, I could sense that all was not as it should be.
Yeah.
Um, I guess a shift for me happened when I was in college, when I was going to, a particular church there in that community that was probably considered kind of one of the more left leaning, more progressive churches of Christ in the city, primarily with worship. They had a praise team, and they were having some of the conversations back in the mid '90s that uh, were characteristic of the worship wars. That I kind of look back at and kind of laugh now, but to be a part of that conversation that had some type of theological framing
Hmm.
where we talked about what does Jesus really think about the mission of a church, what is the mission of a church, and how does that line up with the way we function as a church. And I can remember
Yeah.
very clearly talking about the argument of form following function,
Mm.
and looking at what really is the function, and trying to unpack what command, example, and necessary inference actually meant, and um, trying to understand, okay, in light of this story in the book of Acts, what does this mean for how we actually practice our faith beyond meeting together on Sunday morning, Sunday night, maybe Wednesday night? what
Hmm.
what are we doing here? And probably one of the things that I remember that really kind of perked my ears up was we did a Sunday night kind of communion service
Mm.
at Harding, and that, believe it or not, was pretty radical for folks because it wasn't on Sunday morning,
Yeah.
and but it was all geared around just this very intentional worship. And And at that time, I was still very much with student ministry, and that's probably the main thing that was um, kind of pointing me towards a theological direction, was kind of living in this world of students and their skepticism and their desire to know about apologetics and how can I, defend my faith and this, that, and the other. So
Hmm.
that was really um, why I got into ministry, was my love for students and teenagers. Not because I was young, but just because I love people, and those are kind of the people that I chose. So
Hmm.
after Harding, after graduating, the idea of a full time job really looked appealing. So we transitioned to Dallas, Texas, to be kind of the middle school youth ministers for a huge, predominantly white church here in the Metroplex.
Yeah.
Like 2,000 people on huge for me. 2,000 people on a Sunday morning. I remember having on roll like 185 middle school students, like 30 something middle schools represented, and had no idea what I was doing. But I remember just those same fundamental principles of being valued and being loved and having a place of support. Those were all a part of the fabric of this big, large, you know, kind of suburban church in Dallas, Texas.
Mm-hmm.
At the time, I didn't realize it. It was just a bigger version of what I'd experienced growing
Yeah.
up. I mean, it was still very conservative. It wasn't cutting edge. Still came back together on Sunday nights and sang out of hymn books. And, there was still an expectation that, your spirituality was measured by how many times you showed up to church and, those kinds of things.
Mm-hmm.
But,
Mm-hmm.
you know, that was a big component of my journey was, being loved by church people. And, um, I didn't really have a hard 5 years, first 5 years of ministry, Greg. I mean,
Yeah.
the church didn't chew me up and spit me out. It was a really gracious, affirming experience and journey. And man, I was so fortunate not to be burned.
Yep.
And then I had kids, and I had two children, and I was living at the time, 11 hours away from my family, 10 and a half away from Deborah's family. And I just missed my mom and dad, and I missed the relationship my kids would have with both sets of grandparents. And I had a church in Tennessee call, and out of tremendous hubris, I asked them to come to Dallas and make me an offer. And they asked me to name my price, and I did. And they made me believe that I was the greatest youth minister on the face of the earth, and I believed it. And so, without giving my wife really any agency, I decided to move our family back to Tennessee. And it took me about 6 weeks to figure out that was one of the probably at the time the worst decision I could have made for the season of my life. But it was a much more fundamental and legalistic church than I had been a part of here in
Mm-hmm.
Dallas, and the uh, the theological scales began falling from my eyes pretty quickly,
Yeah.
and there was not the same spirit of trust and generosity that I enjoyed here in Dallas, and it began to get very problematic because the preacher and myself didn't really see eye to eye on many things. And then I was kind of accused of just some false representation of the gospel by, I don't know, like playing Casting Crowns music on Sunday morning during class. I can remember him telling me that if we decided to play Casting Crowns on Sunday morning, then we might as well have peanut butter and jelly for the Lord's Supper. That was kind of his logic. So I didn't really know what to do with that. So um, because he was, you know, in my mind, older, and I'm not sure wiser would be fair, but he certainly has an opinion, and wasn't anything I was going to say that was going to change it. So that led me to kind of deeper questions that really probably that was my first toe into deconstruction, if you would. And then a church in Franklin gave me an opportunity to come and work with some people I had tremendous amount of respect for. It moved us in some ways closer to home, but certainly moved us into a healthier church
Mm-hmm.
environment.
Mm-hmm.
And that transition was um, about the same time that I was kind of knee deep in a Master's of Divinity there at Lipscomb. And that's when I began reading some things and asking some questions, being mentored by some folks that really began to shape my understanding of mission, my understanding of discipleship. Um, it's when I was first introduced to some of Eugene Peterson books, and some of the early missional theology stuff. Shaping of Things to Come by Frost and Hirsch, and some of the more contemporary folks at that time, practical missional theologians like the Doug Padgett's and Rob Bell, and several people like that that were thinking critically about new
Mm.
expressions of church.
Yep.
So that's really when I would say a lot of my theological commitments began to shift, but
Hmm.
they
Hmm.
shifted as my current experience and a context allowed me to shift, because there were lots of questions being raised at that particular church there in Nashville that were healthy and appropriate about what really does it mean to participate in the life of a church, and what does that mean for males versus females. What does that mean for how we think about mission and partners in mission, and what does the First Testament have to say about this, as well as the Second Testament. And you start reading things through the lens of Christopher Wright and Walter Brueggemann, and a host of other theologians, and you start thinking, okay, there's a whole lot here that I don't know a whole lot about.
Hmm.
But what I do know is that what I'm experiencing Sunday in and Sunday out might not be the best representation of what I believe the gospel to really be fully about.
Hmm.
So what I didn't realize at the time is that that was really preparing me for this role of leading a particular local church through a very significant season of reimagination and recontextualization in light of who they were and a desire to be something else.
Yeah.
And I mean, I know that's a huge transition, but that's a pretty good way to say over the last, I start year 17 in August. We have made some major transitions, but those transitions have been in light of a whole lot of discernment and um, my own bent and leaning towards a particular way of reading scripture and understanding the church through that lens.
Right.
So,
Yeah. So, in year 17 at Highland Oaks Church of Christ.
yeah, Highland Oaks in Dallas. Yes.
So you go from the church in Franklin
Yes.
after how many years? And that's still in youth ministry. So 5 years
5 years.
there, also in student ministry, and then from there you transition to, what are we calling it, Pat? Pulpit ministry, executive ministry, lead ministry. What's
Well, it's
the
not executive ministry. Executive would be more like a, you know, chief financial officer, whatever.
okay
I mean, senior minister,
senior? Okay,
my title is lead minister.
you preach every Sunday. That's
I
the
do.
yeah yeah
I tell people I'm one of the ministers here at church. I just happen to be the one that talks more than anybody else on Sunday.
yeah yeah. So how do you go? Just a quick aside. How do you go
Sure.
from youth ministry to preaching ministry? What's the internal process for, okay, it's time to make this shift? I mean, it's not uncommon. There's a lot of youth ministers that seem to age out
Yeah.
into some other form of ministry.
Well, that's a great question, because what when you and I were at Harding, um, there were a ton of Bible majors. In particular, there were a ton of youth ministry majors.
A
In
ton,
fact,
yeah. There were 70 Bible majors in my incoming class, and like well over 50% of them were youth ministry.
okay, my incoming class, there were 130 Bible majors.
Whoa.
Yeah, this was 1995. Um, that,
The the peak, the summit of
it was. I
yeah.
mean, we were coming out of this, the golden age of youth ministry, where youth ministers um, were full staff members. They weren't just volunteers. And
Yeah.
so I drank that Kool-Aid and was taught to never have to apologize for my position, that preaching was not a stepping stone. In fact, you will do your best student ministry when you have kids that are students. So really, I was in, and I was going to be a long-term youth minister, and I really resisted um, the call to go into preaching. I just did,
Hmm.
and um, and there were folks that I would speak, and they would be, of course, very kind and complimentary. And I can remember at the church in Franklin, somebody asking me to kind of throw my name in the hat for preacher, and I had zero, like, no desire to do that.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it caused me to think, I wonder what that would be like, and then I didn't think about it again. And then it came up again a couple of years later, and the right people in my kind of circle of influence, who happen to be mentors, were very serious about me pursuing this preaching life.
Yeah.
And they hooked me up with a mentor at Lipscomb, and I met with him weekly, and it really started to kind of spark my interest. And then the opportunity to be the preacher there at the same church that I was the youth minister came open.
Hmm.
And I basically had my white picket fence story set. Deborah and I were going to transition from beloved student minister to now beloved preacher, and just listen to the pride in that statement, and everything was just going to be this beautiful transition. And I can remember talking to one of my other mentors that we share, that will go unnamed at this time, but I remember him talking to me in the parking lot, and he looked at me and he said, "Pat, I can only name one other Church of Christ where this has happened and it's actually gone well. And it's a
Hmm.
church in Oklahoma." And he was the youth minister there for over 20 years. And I think he transitioned to be the preacher there at that same church. But every other place where this has been tried, it's been really, really difficult.
Hmm.
And
Do you have an idea why that is? Why you think that transition's so
I,
hard?
I it's the scriptural adage of, a prophet's not welcome in its hometown. I just think it's
Okay.
hard
Yeah.
for adults to make the transition in their mind from, oh, this person was the youth minister, now he's going to be our preacher.
Okay.
But in my belief, I didn't understand why that would be so hard, because
Yeah.
people loved me. I felt like people respected me, and that was. But what I began to understand is that preaching was much more about leading people,
Hmm.
as much as wasn't much more. It was as much about leading people as it was about preaching and being immersed in
Yeah.
congregational life and bringing a word of God on behalf of the people of God Sunday in and Sunday out. And then um, the more I got invested into that search process, I started discovering that I'm not sure that preaching there in Nashville is something I want to do, but I still really wanted to do it there because that's where my sense of security and safety came from.
Yeah.
So that's when a church in Dallas called, and I can remember, Deborah telling me that, in no uncertain terms, if we move back to Dallas, you're going to need to find a new wife. And I was like, look, there's no harm in listening. It's, I'm not going anywhere. So I came to Dallas. I did the dog and pony interview. I didn't actually go to the church and do the Sunday thing. It was a meeting at the airport, and it was between me and one other person, and the ball kind of went in favor of this other person. I was kind of the silver medalist, and
Hmm.
I was great with that. That was a strong sign for me that we were supposed to be there in Nashville. And it began looking like I was going to be kind of the lead candidate there for the preaching job there at the same church where I was the youth minister. I mean, it was all coming together. And then some very interesting leadership dynamics began to develop. There were some really unhealthy systems at play that I was really unaware of.
Mm.
And people that were older than I was at the time, who had certainly a much longer tenure and investment in that church, began to really question if I was the right person for the right job. And I began to hear things like, well, this job is too big for Pat, and I'm not sure he's ready. And
Hmm.
it just got really weird in a hurry. Well, Dallas called back and said, well, the guy we really wanted decided to take another job. So now we're coming back to you
Hmm.
because we think you might actually be the one God always intended. It's always interesting how churches
Yeah,
love
yeah,
to
yeah.
throw the God card
Uh
in
huh. Uh huh.
there.
That's a very flattering way of approaching me.
Isn't it
Thank you.
though? Um, so this same mentor that talked to me earlier about this, not being able to transition, told me one of the most valuable things I've ever heard, and I've used this so many times. He said, Pat, um, you are either called in ministry to a place or you're called to a vocation.
Hmm.
If you are called to a place, it shouldn't matter what you do in that place. But if you're called to a vocation, it shouldn't matter where you do it. And Greg, I promise you, that took all of the air out of my lungs. I can remember hearing that going, what am I supposed to do with that?
Yeah.
And at the time I was training to run the half marathon there in Nashville, and I can remember only the second really time in my life where I felt I'm not I don't know if it was the audible voice of God, but it was such a strong sense of peace that I could release myself into this vocation of preaching.
Mm.
And that's when Deborah and I both went back to Dallas, and it was Deborah that said, Pat, we've got to come to this church.
Mm.
And I was blown away because neither one of us, for good reason, didn't care for Dallas in August and September. It was just so hot, and neither one of us liked the Cowboys. And we could go on and on, but apology to all the Cowboys fans. But in some ways, here we are, 17 years later, Greg, and it's rooted in this story of God's incredible call and an orchestration of something that I never saw coming.
Mm.
And it's been an incredible ride. I mean, it's been really hard, but it's been good. So that was a really long way of answering your
That's
question.
great.
What are
Yeah.
some you know things that have shaped? But that's kind of what comes to mind. So what do you want to kind of mine there in what
Well,
I've
I,
shared?
I mean, it's making me reflect a little bit on my own aversion to preaching. Um, but interestingly, for maybe different reasons, I'm just curious how you would respond to kind of my own bent there. Um, you know, as I think I've said before on the podcast, my youth group experience was a huge part of what propelled me into mission work,
Yeah.
and it's also a significant reason why I felt such an aversion to preaching per se. Because my experience of the youth group and youth ministry was that it was kind of subversive
Mm.
within a congregation that was in many ways just middle of the road in our tradition, and that would be with the Sunday preaching and the Sunday evening preaching and the Wednesday preaching, and I mean, and so I kind of felt like, wow, the real action in terms of discipleship and sharing the gospel happens in a totally different format.
Mm.
This is where life really begins to take root, not through the delivery of this sermon that most of the time take it or leave it, and of course this is a high schooler experiencing this, so that's not really commentary on much. But so going into mission work, I felt like, okay, this is the right venue for me to exercise my gifts because we're doing house church planting, so it's very much that same kind of smaller group dynamic of teaching and sharing. And I mean, preaching proclamation happens in that space, but it's not the homiletical format, right? It's not that stand and deliver pulpit audience, all of that kind of thing. And so when we returned from the mission field, one of the questions was, okay, you're going to pursue this PhD and you're going to teach, but if that doesn't work out, ministry is the other alternative. You're already in that world. Would you look at a preaching position somewhere? And my reaction was absolutely not. I mean, it's never ever going to happen. I mean, I remember talking to Megan about this in very stark terms. Like, I will work at McDonald's first. It's not happening. And there. So anyway, there are some things, but I in my master's of divinity program and in my undergraduate program, I did the preaching classes. I read the homiletics books. I kind of knew what that was about. And the guys that were all, and again, guys that were all sort of the ideal version of this, the ones that were greatly respected, they're kind of these homiletical machines. They deliver these crisp, perfect sermons, and their movements and their all of it, and that's what captivates these huge church audiences, and everybody loves it. And I look at that and I just go like, that's not interested. That is not me. I don't care. Not doing it. And then we got pulled into, we joined a smaller church, Hollywood Church of Christ. It was as big as we could handle coming out of house church. We were both kind of like uncomfortable with big church. It didn't fit us, and we were comfortable with a 50 to 70 member church. It's still got a very familial vibe, and I got invited to preach some there, and that was kind of putting my toe into, it's still behind the pulpit and there's the audience, and it's those things that make me uncomfortable, but got to try that on a little bit and found that I didn't hate it, but mostly because of the dynamic of the church that gave that context, right? There's all these other conversations and relationships and opportunities happening on a scale that I feel is manageable, where I still can't imagine, how do you do that? And you can answer this question. How do you do that with 100, 200, 300, 800 people? Like, how do you, what's the connection between the pulpit and the large scale life of a community of that size, if you would call that community? Then we transitioned back to Middle Tennessee, Murfreesboro, Stones River, same size church. And eventually I find myself in the preaching rotation there. There's 3 of us preaching every Sunday. And that becomes like one of my favorite things every third week. I mean, I to the extent that as we prepared a few months ago to move away, I was just lamenting the loss of it. I was feeling I'm so excited to move into professorship and all of that, but I'm gonna deeply miss the opportunity to preach on a regular basis, right? And so for me, it's just been a long but 180 kind of turn, though I still don't know what it's like or how one would go about preaching to a big church on a regular basis. And I still don't know what it's like to do that every week. That seems incredibly draining and intimidating to me to think about every single week. And then I think about those guys that did that 3 times a week, and I go, wow, I don't even know what that. But anyway, I'm just sort of reflecting here on the dynamics of moving into a pulpit-centered kind of ministry, or at least where that's a significant feature. I know that's not everything that preaching ministers do. Well, there are some that's all they do, but they're a small set. Moving into that from a much more relationally centered kind of ministry, and how that for me is a big part of the tension. And just curious how much of that for you was part of it. I hear the calling and that part of it as well. But it seems like a big transition to me, based on my experience. I don't know.
Yeah, boy, you said a lot of really good things there, Greg. Um, I think if I were to kind of talk to somebody about, the role of preaching in the life of a church, um, I don't gravitate towards the desire to be up in front of hundreds and thousands of people week in and week out.
Yeah.
I think that when I was when I was called into the life of preaching, or the preaching life, as Barbara Brown Taylor would say,
Mm.
um, I don't think I realized the expectations that came with that preaching life, especially here in Dallas, Texas, because the expectations were appropriate and fair to the people that had been preaching in this context before. And those expectations were to be the mouthpiece, the spokesperson for this particular church, but also to carry themselves in a particular way, with a specific spiritual authority, and not authority in an inappropriate or certainly criminal way.
Not if it's spiritual. I mean,
It,
that's for me. That's a sufficient qualifier in the context of Christian
well,
theology. If it's spiritual authority, we're
yeah,
okay.
but I know a lot of people that have been convicted of crimes that would claim spiritual authority, and I guess that's what I'm trying
Sure.
to be sensitive about. But and for me, it wasn't so much about making this transition out of relational ministry to something that was much more broad and congregational. It was really taking those relational components and thinking about, okay, what do these relational components look like with adults and with family systems?
Yep.
And really, what I did is I was I was attracted to folks like Fred Craddock and Eugene Peterson, and as I already mentioned, Barbara Brown Taylor. Um, these were people that were, yeah, well, they certainly weren't Church of Christ,
Sure.
and they had fairly small local parishes
Yeah.
that they worked in. And I really fell in love with how preaching could be a way of spiritually forming a church towards a particular way of thinking about God and God's movement in the world. So preaching was less performative,
Mm-hmm.
and it became more of a way to think about spiritual formation
Yep.
and what can discipleship look like. And that was not at all the culture that Dallas, Texas had in mind.
Yeah.
When we first arrived here in Dallas, there were 1,000, 1,100 people here on a Sunday. We also had another campus up north, and it was kind of one church in two locations. And for several months, I would preach at one location, get in the car, and drive to the next. And I knew that getting into it, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to kind of get a lot of that experience under my wings. But the more I did it, the more I was convinced, Greg, that this is not sustainable for me.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't sustainable because it wasn't matching up with my core theological convictions,
Yep.
which were, how do you how do you pastor a group of people in which you don't know everybody's name? I don't.
Right.
I can't. It's not a part of the fabric of who I am. Some
Yep.
people can do that, and I'm certainly not criticizing those that do, but I can't imagine
Yeah, that's
relationally doing my job
yeah.
without knowing the people I'm preaching to.
Yeah, that's generous, and I don't mind being a little. I don't mind being a little spicier here. Some people do that. I'm not so sure. I, I appreciate that there are some things that can happen through public proclamation to a
Sure.
big group. I don't know if
Yeah.
you can call that pastoring them.
No.
And that's I mean that's very much the point of what I'm getting at
Yeah.
is this necessary connection between you're saying pastoring. I'm going to use my pet word, discipleship. There's all this other stuff happening in the life of the community that the sermon should be making sense of.
Yes.
And if that stuff isn't happening because really all the church life is the sermon event, then we have a problem. And if what you specialize in is the sermon event, I have my doubts, regardless of scale, that there is a strong connection between those things. And I'm not saying there can't be. I just haven't seen it, Pat. I find it hard to imagine. I'll put it that way. I find it hard to imagine. Again, based only on my experience,
Sure.
which is far from enough to make any kind of strong claim. But that's core. That's central to what's going on here. And I appreciate you saying theological commitments because that's what's at stake. What is your vision of what the church is? What is this life actually about? What's supposed to be happening in terms of spiritual formation? And then you can ask the question, and then what is the sermon for? What does it do? Why are we doing this? You know?
Yeah. And two, Greg, you know, being in the 90s and the early 2000s, I think a definition of church success that many people bought into was the larger the church, the more successful that it is.
Okay.
Um, when you start, looking around at, you know, Rick Warren and Saddleback and, Rob Bell in Minnesota and even in our own tribe, the big church in Fort Worth and the big church in Atlanta and the big church in Nashville
Yeah.
and there was a pretty solid divide between, at least from my perspective, kind of the haves and the have-nots.
Mm-hmm.
And Highland Oaks would definitely be among the haves.
Yeah.
So when I came, there was this desire to stay a large, successful, forward-thinking church. And I think what I brought to the table was a desire to lead a group of people towards a different end, where the end was not how many people can we get here,
Yeah.
but rather the end was for the people who come and assemble here. What would it be like to send them back into the world to participate in partnership with God? And that's not an easy thing to just say and people buy into automatically. My experience here at Highland Oaks in particular has been that has to be backed up by a lot of very practical things. And in some ways, Greg, if I may, it's a push against Western society's expectations of what success looks like.
Of course.
And it is very much informed by a particular way of understanding gospel and kingdom and Jesus's teaching on mustard seed and yeast and of course Jesus led the thousands, and of course at Pentecost there were 3,000 and more that were saved, but is that really what we're about? Is attracting these large groups of people, or is it about forming a particular group of people?
Yeah.
And it's just a different way of thinking about ministry.
Yeah.
And for me, I am more bent towards what can discipleship look like for a local congregation that tries to live into partnership with God in their local community.
Yeah.
And the more we explored that here at Highland Oaks, the more it changed the way we thought about our building, the more it changed the way we thought about our debt, the more it changed the way we thought about having two locations in one church. Because I don't think you can effectively pastor, one person can pastor two locations in the same city. I mean, just practically that doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
Right.
How one person can oversee that in a healthy way. And of course, I
Yeah.
know that there are arguments to be made for support staff and, like you said, executive ministers and site ministers and campus ministers
Yeah,
and I
you could
get
set it
all
up
that.
like a corporation, of course.
Yeah, and I get all that. Um, but
It's
for
not what the
me,
church is, but yeah, you could do that.
um, but for me, I'm trying to be generous here. But for
You're good
me,
at it too.
for me, I like to tell people that I have successfully led our church from two campuses to one, from about 1,000 people to about 200 people, from a weekly giving contribution. Our weekly giving contribution, Greg, when I first got here, was like $47,000 a week. To now it's like 18.
Yeah.
And I have grown our church to the place where we are now.
Yes.
But growth looks like incredibly deep, focused discipleship. Now, there are many things we are not doing nearly as well as I think we could be doing or should be doing. But as far as how we think about church
Yeah.
and ways of measuring success, I could not be more grateful and more proud of how far we've come,
Yeah.
because it has certainly come with its lumps and its heartaches.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that you went there, because I do see this organic connection between the conversation so far and what you're characterizing as successfully leading a church to be much smaller numerically,
sure,
and to characterize that as growth. Again, this is rooted in theological perspectives and commitments, and I just completely agree with you. Now, there's part of this where you go, okay, so if you're gonna begin challenging some of those Western cultural, let's call them Christendom assumptions,
yes,
then you will have a reduction in attendance. Those numbers are going to go down because you're preaching and leading and discipling people who didn't sign up for anything other than membership of a church that is essentially about the preaching event. And so of course you're gonna lose people when you start leading in that direction. I think that should be obvious. That should be a given. I don't think that that's in any way controversial. And anybody who thinks that it can go the other way just doesn't understand what cultural critique does
yeah,
to a church. But then there's a deeper component of this that is not only defying those cultural expectations, but also leading people to the cross. And where Jesus is at the center of this gospel, and that means the cross and the resurrection are at the center of this gospel, you're now asking people essentially to sign up for something that's not only not what they thought they signed up for, but that is the call to die to yourself. And that has never been a very popular proposal.
yeah,
And I actually defy anyone who says that the large crowds that followed Jesus or the large crowd at Pentecost are any kind of justification of this idea of preaching to a large crowd being normative or being the goal, much less. those large crowds that followed Jesus, that heralded his coming into Jerusalem, are the same ones that screamed, "Crucify him."
Sure.
Those large crowds at Pentecost were people who had been formed in a multitude of ways already to be prepared to hear the message that Peter preached. It's not simply televangelism. It's not standing up and delivering a good sermon and then people going, "Sign me up." There is no indication of any of that. Our best model, and I feel very confident saying this, our best model for Christian ministry is Jesus himself. He spent a few years deeply forming 12 guys. One in 12 betrayed him to death, and the other 11 ran away when they realized what the cross was about.
Yeah.
So let's just be very clear about what it is we're leading people to through the sermon, through the rest of our ministry, and set our expectations accordingly. I've said this in all kinds of different forums, and I guess you just have to keep saying it given the assumptions that still reign. No problem with big numbers. I have no problem with a lot of people getting excited about the cross. I just don't think that that's any way to set our expectations for what ministry should be about, what health is, what growth is, what's supposed to happen when we actually step into God's mission. And so, yeah, I love the way that you. Let me say this. I suspect there are people that would hear you talk about the growth trajectory of Highland Oaks and say, "Okay, that's spin. That's a way of trying to positively characterize something bad that happened."
Yeah.
And I just want to say, since I know you, it's not. This is actually your perspective. It's
Yeah.
actually the way that you chose to lead. You knew what was going to happen, and you led the church through the pain of it happening intentionally.
Yeah.
And
This is not me theologically trying to make lemonade out of lemons.
no,
Yeah, you're exactly right. One of the stories, and first of all, you can't deny some of the cultural realities of which the church cannot help, which is, declining attendance numbers, a global pandemic. None of those things were things on, the church bingo card to say, I would love to be a part of a dying, group of people.
right?
So, I think just practically speaking, sometimes it's healthy to acknowledge that there are factors going on that are beyond our control. Now, what we do with those factors, how we talk about those factors, really matter. So, when our attendance began to decline at Highland Oaks, because of some of our intentional choices of the participation of women for being more welcoming to those in the gay community, whatever. We were stuck with this very big building that was designed for a particular outcome. The particular outcome was not fellowship, was not fellowship by way of speaking to each other, engaging with each other. There were very few common spaces in which you can interact. The focus was around an auditorium where people sat in seats facing the stage. So it was very clear that the epicenter of the building was the actual event of the assembly.
Yeah.
So when you have, a few hundred people meeting in a space designed for 1,800 people, you got to figure out what to do. Do you sell? Do you use it for other purposes? And we decided, because of our commitment to the community, to begin to use it for other purposes.
Yep.
So before COVID hit, we actually had 7 different faith communities using our space over the course of a weekend. And to me, it was a beautiful representation of our theological conviction of we do not exist as the Highland Oaks Church just for ourselves. We have been entrusted with this resource. We want to be good stewards of it. And so we had, an instrumental service going on in our fellowship hall. We had a Hispanic service going on right behind our door. We had an English speaking service. We had a deaf speaking service. And then we had 3 other churches using our building over the course of a weekend. It was great. But then all of a sudden, a mega church came along and met with me and wanted to buy our building. This, in many ways, this sacred cow of an institution here in Dallas that is a part of the fabric of who Highland Oaks has always been. Highland Oaks has always been, oh, that's that big building on 635. Oh, that's where so and so preached. That's where thousands of singles came back in the 80s. That's where all of these people who were divorced discovered grace. Yes, all of those things are true, but they're not necessarily true now because we're in a different time and a different place.
Yep.
So when this mega church came along and wanted to buy our building, it was an incredible opportunity to move in a fresh direction that I didn't feel we were necessarily looking for, but I felt like God kind of gave us this opportunity, this push, if you will, to continue to reimagine ourselves in light of these theological convictions. And in a lot of ways, it was like, okay, if you're really serious about these theological convictions, then you're going to sell this big ass building and you're going to burn the ships and you're going to do church smaller.
Yep.
Because it allowed us, the potential was to allow us to sell, get out of debt, reinvent ourselves apart from an identity that was attached to a particular structure or building.
Yes.
I mean, there was a Texas historic marker outside of our building. We would host conferences in our tribe. I mean, people would have concerts at our building. I mean, this just wasn't some cavernous thing that wasn't being used. It was being used a lot. And you can imagine the pushback we got wanting to sell our building and just the deep and even appropriate sadness that came along with that.
Yep.
But at the same time, Greg, it was always interesting to me how many of the older generation came to me and said, Pat, I've never really liked this big old building anyway. And, I always felt like we were worshiping kind of in a mall anyway. And it's just really interesting what that kind of uncovered. And then when we did finally sell, which we sold to another faith community, I mean, it's not like we sold to an apartment complex or we sold to the city of Dallas and they leveled it. I mean, it is being used for, albeit a different theological trajectory, but, it's not like it's not being used for, some type of inherent goodness.
Yeah. We
found a space less than a quarter of a mile from that building. We were able to maintain all of our community relationships. We're able to get out of debt, set up a generous endowment to fund local ministry here. And it's been just an unbelievable weight, practical weight lifted off of our shoulders so that we can live into these, gospel convictions without having this enormous weight of, man, how are we going to fill all these seats? And, what are we going to do Sunday in and Sunday out? And I mean, it allowed us to even reimagine what our worship space could even look like because we had a blank slate. And I'll be the first to tell you that that's scary. It is not easy. But I also want to say this as loudly and as clearly as I can. We were not in financial crisis. We did not sell out of some deep need to absolve ourselves from this gigantic structure that was just draining all of our life and our energy. That wasn't the case. We were making the best use of the space that we knew how. But somebody came along and made an offer that no one in their right mind would refuse. But others would look at it and see it as a sign of failure. Oh, you've given up on a dream. Well, in some ways, yes, that was the final nail in the coffin of giving up on the Western dream of if you build this church building, people will come.
Yeah.
We were finally putting that dream to rest and having a space where we could live into another type of dream.
Yeah.
And the people have that who chose to stay have lived into this idea with just great trust, with great humility, with incredible gratefulness. Not to mention the fact, Greg, that as we were making these transition, over the last 2 or 3 years, I mean, we have five elders who died, three of which it was unexpected, and there was a lot of headaches with the church that bought our building that we didn't expect, and there are all kinds of. It's not like because we moved into this faithful mission of God that absolved us from any difficult free circumstances.
Seldom
Um,
does it.
yeah, no kidding. As anybody that's been on the mission field would know, but I guess all I'm saying is that if people are going to preach about the gospel, dying to self,
Yeah.
and sacrificing, because what's happened, Greg, is that just one information bite here. People would see a contribution of $45,000 a week and say, "Man, that's incredible." Well, it was incredible for the 26 families that made up 85% of that contribution.
Hmm.
26 families out of like 400. That's not a very good percentage.
Hmm.
And now we have about 68% of our folks giving.
Yeah.
Whereas 17 years ago, we had about 30% of our folks giving.
Hmm.
So which is more successful? The
Mm.
larger weekly giving or the percentage of people who actually give what they can and are called to do? That
Yeah.
to me, those are the healthy signs of deepening discipleship that not a lot of people get to talk about because
Yeah.
they see the size of our church and I hear this, they're like, oh, that's so sad. I mean, Highland Oaks has lost so many people. I bet that's really hard. Well, yeah, it is hard. It's hard to lose people that you've gained relationship with,
Hmm.
but it's also been a beautiful testimony to God's faithfulness to what I feel like has been a move in some really helpful and beautiful directions. That may be more than you want to hear, but
Not at all. Not at all.
but anyway, thanks for letting me go off on that diatribe.
No, that's great. So I'm interested in the point that you made loudly and clearly that the debt and the burden of the financial burden of maintaining that size of property didn't figure in the way that it does for many churches in
Right.
similar positions. Churches that have massive facilities, carry massive debt, and have the declining numbers inside of that, and maybe attempt to do some creative rental and usage kinds of agreements and generate income in that way, and still just can't make it work. You're saying that wasn't a major concern for y'all when you made the decision to sell. So I don't know. I still wonder what you would say about the nature of carrying that kind of financial burden in relation to other priorities. Do you look at that as simply just sort of a practical, if you can manage it financially, whatever, or being now in a position where you have a building paid off and an endowment, and how do those two things compare for you, not only practically but theologically?
Well, theologically, they don't compare. Um, and I guess what I mean by that is when you um, when you are in a position where you can only do so much because your debt keeps you from being able to dream God's dream, which to me is not a lack of faith. It's just a practical reality of what is.
Hmm.
Um, because, Greg, I can say that with the assurance that I was paying for decisions that I didn't make.
Mm.
Um,
The
you know,
decisions to build that big a property, and then
absolutely.
yeah.
And not only that, decisions to build that property and amass even further debt.
Mm.
Um, and I don't mind saying this. I mean, when I arrived, 17 years ago, the church was $7.5 million in debt.
Hmm.
When we sold, we were $2.5 million in debt.
Yeah.
So that was over 12, 13 years. We were able to pay down $5 million in debt. So
Yeah.
there was an end in sight for
Hmm.
paying off the debt.
Hmm. Hmm.
We were doing it. I mean, we weren't drowning.
Yeah.
I would say the morale was probably suffering more than anything
Yeah.
because that's all people could see when they walked into our assembly was how many people weren't there.
Which
And they
means
were
lower
reminded,
contribution, which means slower payoff of the debt, and
of
it's
course,
so
of
you're
course.
doing it. There's good stewardship happening there in terms of
Yes,
funds and getting out of debt, but at the same time, it's what you're doing. That's
absolutely.
that's where, I mean, it's not all you're doing, obviously, but it's so much a part of like what the church has to take care of. I just have to imagine. I haven't been in that position, Pat. I haven't led a church with that kind of burden. I just have to imagine that that's a constant strain to
It
to
is.
need to do that every week and worry about how much did come in and how much can we pay off and so on.
Yeah, yes, I think when you're paying between, fifteen and $18,000 a month in overhead, um, there's no way that can't be a strain.
Yeah.
It's so if you begin to think, okay, what would it look like if we didn't have that burden? Because it's really when it comes down to it, Greg, churches are no different than families. They can
Hmm.
afford what they're willing to give up.
Hmm.
And so what we had to do is we had to give up this dream of being this megachurch.
Yeah.
We had to give up this idea that the more people that show up here, the more important we're going to be.
Yeah.
And people still, even now, and you've been in our news space. On our the fire codes, we can't sit more than 300. We can only sit 298. So we have about 290 chairs. Now, we don't fill 290 chairs, but we still have people who talk about, man, I can't wait to fill this place, what it's going to sound like.
Hmm.
And I have
Hmm.
to really still push against that idea of, well, are you saying that because that means we're not successful now and we one
Yeah.
day will be? Because there is an incredible freedom that comes with not having to be enslaved to debt,
Yeah.
not having to be enslaved to um, particular people who give a particular amount of money. I mean,
Yeah.
let's just
And
call it what it
you
is.
got to please your shareholders. That's right.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I don't look at it as pleasing my shareholders as much as I do, what does it look like to invite them into to a gospel that can look different, that
Yeah.
is that pushes against these cultural norms of keeping up with the Joneses.
Hmm.
And that's really hard in Dallas, Texas, especially when there's so many options right down the street.
Yeah.
Um, so anyway, I could say a lot more about it, but does that answer your question?
Yeah. 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 No, I just wanted you to reflect on that a little bit because
Sure.
again, not in my experience, but also definitely on my radar as I look at the state of churches in the United States and recognize even much smaller churches functioning with this tremendous overhead and therefore having to make compromises that genuinely run against their theological commitments.
Should
The
anyway.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
okay. And so, no, I think that's a really significant dimension of beyond calling it a practical change, right?
Yeah.
It's a significant dimension of what it means to lead into a different kind of growth, a different kind of health and life together, that can get glossed over because Americans are so practically minded, and we shoehorn church into the corporate model, and it's like this: you spend money to make money, and all of this kind of stuff is just it's endemic for us and our way of thinking, and by being so normalized, we often don't really go, okay, what are we paying here beyond the money? We're paying something
Yeah.
significant, and to the detriment of what and whom. And so I just wanted to hear you talk about that a little bit because your experience is so that's a vital component of what your leadership has meant over the last 17 years at Highland Oaks.
I would just add to that, Greg. You know, I think it was leadership consultant Ron Heifetz that said that you know leadership is disappointing people at a rate they can stand,
Mm.
and in a lot of ways that's true. But man, have I really understood that in the last 7 to 8 years,
Mm-hmm.
especially since post COVID,
Yep.
because people, at least the people here at Highland Oaks, they were so tired of doing hard things.
Yeah.
COVID was hard. Selling our building was hard. Some of the theological moves we've made have been really hard, and it's there. There is an exhausting component to that, and all I can say is that yes, it's been intentional, but it's been intentional as much as it's been in line with the burden that we, and I do mean we, have felt as a leadership here at Highland Oaks to pay attention to how the Spirit of God is moving us closer to the Lordship of Jesus. And I think that can mean different things for different places.
Yeah.
But for us, it was definitely about, um, pun intended, putting our money where our mouth is.
Right.
Um, Selling our gigantic structure for the sake of getting small so that we could really live more freely
Mm-hmm.
into the expression that we feel is more authentic to
Yep.
our interpretation of words like gospel, mission, discipleship.
Yep.
So anyway, that's the
Yeah.
bow I would put on that.
Well said. Well said. Okay, so one more thing.
Sure.
You a couple of years ago launched a new initiative that you invited me to participate in graciously called the Restoration Collective.
Yeah.
And I just want to, this can be maybe a little commercial, but I do want to kind of talk through what led to your imagination for this,
Sure.
what the priority is, what it's about, and why.
Great question. I think the Restoration Collective came from a burden that I felt after having several conversations with folks in leadership amongst our tribe in the Churches of Christ. And it was heavily bent towards cynicism and wondering if our tribe in our restoration movement was going to have any survivability based upon our declining numbers.
Right. Same conversation.
So I was invited to kind of a think tank of about 40 ministers to kind of go through some research that was done by some, I think some well trained statisticians that
Mhm.
examined kind of the whys and reasons about the declining numbers.
Yep.
And I felt like the conversation was geared more towards, okay, how can we grow our churches again
Yeah.
numerically? Which,
Stop the bleeding, reverse the trend.
exactly. So that was also held alongside of a lot of people, younger generations, not only at Highland Oaks, but other places, just completely jumping ship and saying, I am frustrated with the Churches of Christ and their lack of passion for racial reconciliation, their lack of inclusion of people on the margins, whatever. And there was just this deep seated cynicism, which
Hmm.
was appropriate. So I began to imagine what it would look like to gather people together who were more hopeful,
Yeah.
that would take parts of our movement, the restoration movement, and ask better questions with a more hopeful and bent towards God resurrecting our tribe and doing a new thing, rather than just saying we just need to absolve into this greater evangelical world.
Mm.
And so, imagining what theological commitments might fuel that hope filled imagination,
Hmm.
particularly around reading scripture through a more missional lens, reading scripture as less as constitutional document, more as a story to live into, participate in, paying attention to the Holy Spirit, the full participation of both men and women. Those are the things that I wanted to kind of say. What would it look like if a group of people kind of assembled with those convictions and commitments? Could we imagine a more hopeful future?
Yeah.
And what we've seen over the last couple of years is really an outpouring of interest from across the country, for those that are all about having a conversation, because they are disheartened by the lack of people that are coming to their church, but they're also not as cynical as their friends are. And
Yeah.
they're looking for something to be hopeful about.
Yeah.
So, Restoration Collective, there's kind of three C's. It gathers to have conversation, to make connection, and to encourage people to be a catalyst for leading in their local context. So, conversation, connection, and to be a catalyst. Those are kind of the three hallmarks. And so we gather by Zoom, usually every month, and we'll have our second in-person gathering in November, and it really functions around testimony, sharing story, and entering into those conversations and making those connections with one another as we become catalysts for change in our local context.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's my spiel.
It's awesome. And one of the things that excites me about it is the importance of those three C's, especially for folks who are isolated in ministry contexts where they don't have much of a support system. Maybe they're a little bit on the margins of the tradition because they're thinking in new directions, innovatively. I hesitate to use the word progressive or whatever because it brings to mind things that are kind of beside the point in some ways. But just people who are looking at the situation and wanting to be hopeful about not simply doing more of the same thing and expecting different results,
Yeah.
right? But that can be so lonely, and we talked a lot about that in our first leadership gathering. Just the profound isolation and loneliness that a lot of people throughout the country, especially those who aren't in the Bible Belt, feel as they think about, okay, I'm facing these challenges in my context. I have hopes, I have dreams about where how we can lead, like Pat, uh, into a different vision of what it means to be a healthy community,
Mm.
and not simply hitch my wagon to this notion that I've got to figure out how to both keep saying the same things we've been saying, doing the same things we've been doing, and grow a bigger membership, right? But instead, stand for, speak out for, preach about, live into commitments that are much more, in my view, about the kingdom of God,
Yes.
and and then trying to do that all by yourself, uh, and or maybe catching a conversation or two throughout the year with somebody else at a conference or over a coffee or whatever, and that being all there is to sustain that ministry, is just a really tough place to be. And so I part of the thing that makes me hopeful is creating this network of
Yeah.
mutual support and vision and hope, that can remain firmly us in terms of the ways that we're rooted in our theological tradition, and yet dream and move in new directions.
Yeah, and one of the things that's beautiful about, when we gather on Zoom, Greg, is that, there's, practically speaking, there's not a ton of people that, for one reason or another, that are able to gather every month because of scheduling and whatnot. But for the 15 or 20 that do, I mean, we have people from, Massachusetts and New Jersey and New York and Oklahoma and Alabama and Tennessee and Texas and California and
California,
Colorado,
Canada. Yeah.
Canada, and it's just it's amazing that I won't say you,
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
forget that people do feel isolated.
Oh, yes.
Even people in Arkansas, I had a great conversation with a friend of mine. We had lost touch, and he reached out and he said, I've planted this church in my hometown, and the other churches of Christ just really don't want anything to do with us because
Yep.
of some things that we're doing. And I just don't feel an attachment to anything right now. I don't feel attachment to the university I used to. I don't feel the attachment to this particular lectureship. And I really feel like I need a group of people. Is
Hmm.
the Restoration Collective one of those groups of people? And I said, yes.
Yep.
It's exactly who we're trying to exist for. So yeah, I really get excited about the opportunity to bring people together to receive encouragement and the courage to lead in their local context, because that's going to look different in Highland Oaks than it is in where I'm from in Tullahoma, Tennessee.
That's right.
Um, but they need to know that we've got each other's back, and there's places of theological conversation that we can have that's safe,
Yeah.
that's open,
Well
that
said.
you can come and ask questions, and hopefully leave with some ideas. So yeah, I think anybody to listen to this wants to be a part of that. Contact Greg, send me an email. We'll get you on
Hmm.
the list,
Hmm.
and of course, we'd love to see you in November if that's possible. But this is not about a group of talking heads. In fact, we don't even list or feature particular keynotes. We just say, hey, come and be a part of this conversation, and I hope it'll really be a beautiful thing come November. So
Yeah. I'll say one more thing about it, uh, that to me is really significant for our tribe. Insignificant for some other tribes, but I think this matters, and that is that the leadership team that you put together is men and women,
oh yes,
and the space is designed to work on an assumption that doesn't exist in any other possibly similar insofar as there are other similar gatherings or venues for connection and conversation and all that kind of stuff, and that is the assumption that women have 100% full participation in everything that's going on. Their voices are equal, and there's no equivocation about that. And so the reason that that's significant is because even in other spaces, I think, where women might participate, there is a different assumption about where the buck stops and who says what at the end of the day, and the women that are happily a part of this group, as you've shared with me, have expressed that it's the first time they've ever been in that kind of environment where there's just this working assumption. It's not a conversation. It's not a point of debate. It's simply the assumption, how we operate. And I think that's really important, just to put out there as well, that this space does exist. It's in our tribe. We are still us, and this is our working assumption.
yeah, and I know that this probably doesn't need to be said, but I'm going to say it anyway. It's an assumption driven by a theological conviction
Yes.
that men and women are both equally gifted by God to embody uh, whatever God has given them to embody, whether they be preaching, leading, and whatever. And yeah, it is sad that our tribe and most Christian tribes are known for this men only club.
Hmm.
And Greg, I'll be honest with you. If there's anything I want to give the next 5 years of my life to, it's trying to create spaces for women to have a voice in ministry. I feel stronger about that now than I even did a year ago, and
Yeah.
it's based on conversations I have with other women. They need spaces where they feel and experience equality. They don't need necessarily more women's retreats any more than men need more men's retreats. Although those are wonderful expressions of what can happen,
Sure.
but they need spaces where they can share together in these equitable ways. And
Participate fully as members of the body. That's right.
absolutely,
What the
and you're
Spirit
right,
is doing in them is for the church.
absolutely, and fully welcome.
That's
So
right.
thanks for pointing that out.
Well, thank you. Thank you for taking the time and sharing so much of your story. And I think it'll be encouraging and instructive to a lot of people. So I'm
Well,
grateful.
it's an honor, Greg. It's an honor to have you a part of our family. I guess you can stay. So
Thank you very much.
all right,
Well,
my
God
buddy.
bless, Pat. All right.
Thanks.
We'll talk soon.